This is a really important part of Rooster Teeth games.
Yes.
Whenever anybody has like a really sick burn or makes a really sweet basketball shot, we just all day long.
Actually, I don't think William got his for his burn last night. I asked William last night if we're friends on Facebook, and to which he replied,
We're not friends anywhere, Jeff.
What was the one that you got me for the other day?
I think
luck.
that takes too much time.
Yeah,
actually.
too much of a backstory.
Anyway, you guys want to? What's that? We got 2 minutes.
Well, the gist of it was I was like explaining something fairly metaphysical, and Jeff said something like, "How does it feel being Will Smith's son?"
See, you really had to be there, like that.
Yeah.
Right there. I think. Do you guys want to go ahead and get started? Or should we wait until?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. The doors are closed.
Could you guys go ahead and dim the lights?
Show's about to begin.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the tech behind RWBY Grimm Eclipse. So we're going to talk about some pretty technical stuff during this talk. So if you're a person that makes games or wants to make games or a modder or just curious, then you'll find it really interesting. Otherwise, you might be bored. All right, so I'm Casey Donnellan. I'm the lead engineer on RWBY Grimm Eclipse. This is Abe Robertson. He's our lead level designer. Jeff Chamberlain is another engineer, and Will Venice is another engineer. So this is the entire engineering team and almost the entire level design team for the game. So brief overview of what we're going to talk about. Some of the challenges we faced. Networking, not like meeting people, but multiplayer networking. The object database system, AI, team attacks, camera achievements, triggered actions, encounters, the R production pipeline, and then we'll take some questions. Right. So, RWBY Grimm Eclipse, pretty fun game. What maybe a lot of people don't understand is the scope of what we attempted to make. This is a big game. It's a lot bigger than maybe it would seem to somebody that doesn't know a lot about game development. And that's for a few key reasons. The first of which is that it's content driven. So there's a lot of really cool and interesting games that aren't content driven. So like FTL, one of my favorite games of all time, is really systems driven.
Yeah.
So it has a little bit of content that keeps getting remixed in really interesting ways, and that makes the game really replayable. Our game isn't really like that. It's content driven, it's story driven. The environment art, the encounters, the character movesets, that's what makes it interesting. And all of that content has to be hand authored, and it's really time consuming to do. So normally content driven games like Halo, for instance, you're going to have dev teams that number in the hundreds. We had 10 people, and we didn't even have 10 people for that whole time.
Probably for the majority, we had 5.
Yeah. So we had to come up with some really clever stuff to try to build content really quickly, and we used some really cutting-edge tools and techniques to do so. Another reason the game was really, what's the word I'm looking for?
Difficult.
Yeah, difficult to challenge, yeah. Is network multiplayer. So that anything you try to do a networked, it makes it harder. So we had that burden the entire time. Third-person camera, maybe something you wouldn't even give a second thought to. AAA games will often have an entire team of people devoted to just the camera. And like Abe and I built it in like 2 weeks. And complex characters, so like bipedal character animations, complicated movesets. There's just a lot going on in combat, and getting that all in and maintaining it was really complicated. And we did it all in a little bit over a year. So yeah, just a crazy amount of stuff. So diving right in, networking. So we used what's called Photon. It's a plugin for Unity, and it's a like soup to nuts networking solution for building a multiplayer game. It's really awesome. We use it for matchmaking, all the way down to like sending RPCs and serialization info across the network.
What's an RPC, Casey?
A remote procedure call. So it's like when the server would say, do this, and all the clients do that thing. So one thing you might not know about the game is that it's peer-to-peer. So there's no dedicated servers. One of the players is the server, and they make a lot of decisions about the things that happen in the game. So because there's no dedicated servers, we can't really make a lot of guarantees about like latency. So the person that's the server may not be on your continent. They may have a really bad internet connection. They may have a really slow computer. So taking that into account and the fact that it's a co-op game, we did a lot of things that were actually client authoritative. Generally, that's not a good idea. So if you're making a competitive multiplayer game, you never want to do that because people could cheat. So what client authoritative means is the clients, the people that aren't the server, are saying things that they're doing, and the server is kind of just taking them at their word. So you could hack your client to say, I'm here, I do this much damage, and the server just says, okay. But because we're not making Team Fortress or Call of Duty, and everyone's on a team anyway, cheating isn't as much of an issue.
Yeah, so a lot of the times I think client versus server authoritative comes down to whether or not it's PvP versus PvE.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so another aspect of that is there's a lot of things that are they're really quick. So like counters are a great example of that. An enemy in our game will start doing an attack that's counterable, and the client has to, the player on the client has to hit the button in a really short time frame. If we were going to send those messages back and forth to the server, there just wouldn't be enough time. The enemy would either have to wait before it did its attack to make sure that you didn't counter in time, or it would have to start doing its attack and then get interrupted. So that's an example of where we place the authority for what actually should have happened on the client. Next slide, Jeff. So the object database. So the object database is probably the most boring part of this talk, but it is the backbone of our game. And it's one of the things that I find the most interesting. So like I said, there's tons and tons of content, and we had to find a way to author all of that and do it in a way that was maintainable. So the game has a bunch of different databases that reference all kinds of objects, and these objects describe how to do different things in the game, or how different things in the game should behave or appear. Could you hit the next slide? So the leftmost one, this is like a view of the Unity inspector. So this is some of the actual game data you're looking at. So the leftmost one is a message from Dr. Oobleck, one you see in Mountain Glen 2. And it shows like the text for the message, it has a reference to the audio clip, it has a reference to what image to use on the scroll, all kinds of things. All of these things are put together in a database, and then when something happens in game, instead of the server telling the client, I want you to play this message from Dr. Oobleck with this image, with whatever, it just says, I want you to do this character message, here's the ID. You use that ID to look up all that information on your machine and perform that message on your own. So this pattern is used all over the place. So the leftmost one is a message from Dr. Oobleck. The middle one is the definition for a Beowulf Alpha. The one on the right is a definition for Ruby's team attack. Next slide. And then going from left to right, the one on the left is Ruby herself, which that's not all of the data in the game for Ruby, but it's part of it. The one in the middle is a single hit from RWBY, and the one on the right is information about how to perform a camera shake. So it's something like camera shakes are probably things that like most people aren't even necessarily cognizant of them happening, but like we have a piece of data that describes exactly how to do one, and it follows the curve there in the image. And
So like when an Ursa slams on the ground, your camera actually moves a little bit and shifts and really gives you that impression of weight and gravity of something happening.
It's one of those things that you really notice if it isn't there, but you may not notice if it is.
yeah. So there's about 2,000 of these objects in the game, and we're adding more all the time. So just tons and tons of data. So there has to be a good way of authoring it and keeping track of it. Another thing that's really nice about this system is it separates the data out into lots of different places, and it makes it easier for multiple people to work on it at the same time. So like a lot of the data, like that message from Oobleck, it only is specific to one level, but the data doesn't live inside that scene file. It lives in this other file. So somebody could come and update it without updating that scene, and it just makes things easier on everybody. Could you go to the next slide? AI. So the AI in this game is not the most complicated. You know, it's not going to play chess against you, but it does do a few interesting things. So one thing it does is what we call the Kung Fu circle. So if you just kind of stand there and let the enemies come towards you, you might notice that they form this ring around you. And the way that actually happens is enemies are attracted to the players they're trying to kill, but they repel each other. So every frame, they're trying to move towards you, but then they're also trying to move away from each other, and you end up with this nice ring that they form. It's like almost like a natural phenomenon once you set up the code to make them repel each other. So it's kind of a simple trick, but you end up with this really cool effect from it. So another thing that is kind of running the AI is this system called the engagement manager. So the enemies in the game have a table that tracks how much aggro they have towards different players and other targets, like the control center. As you attack them or don't attack them, you'll gain more aggro or lose aggro. And the engagement manager looks at all that aggro and says, okay, this Beowulf attack RWBY, this Beowulf attack Weiss. And all of the enemies that are focused on a single player, the engagement manager looks at all of them, and each different type of enemy has a score. So the stronger the enemy, the higher their score is. It adds up all of those scores together, and then it plugs that value into this graph. So the numbers are really small, but the x-axis is the score, and the y-axis gives a time interval. So the more enemies there are, the less time between attacks, but it's not linear at all. It actually uses this graph that we hand-authored. So I don't know. I thought that was a pretty novel way of doing things, and you end up with like a nice feeling of challenge that scales in a nice way. Originally, we had the enemies, each one would have its own timer, and it would attack when the timer went off. And the harder enemies would have a lower timer, but what you'd end up with is like 5 of the timers might go off at once, and you have 5 guys attacking you all at once. And that didn't feel good. So we ended up doing a system more like this. So that covers how some of the enemy attacks are coordinated. Others are actually triggered by player actions. So if you press the counter button at the wrong time, it'll actually provoke an attack from an enemy. Or if you attack an enemy that's stunned and you attack them a certain number of times, depending on the type of enemy, it might provoke a reaction attack where they might jump back and do a swipe at you. And a lot of the decisions for things like that are actually made on the client because it's all stuff that needs to happen really quickly in order for it to feel good. All right, Jeff, you want to
I'm up.
tell us about team attacks?
Yeah, so when I joined the team, it was about a little under 2/3 of the way through the project's entire life cycle. So I actually wasn't around for the inception of a lot of these systems. They were already created by the time I got there. But I did get to see the iteration of a lot of them and how they sort of grew and changed as we were going through and finishing the game. And one such system was, of course, team attacks, which was a really interesting challenge for us as a team. So, you know, we're coming in using the RWBY property, and all of our players, or most of our players, probably have a sort of preconceived notion about what team attacks are and what they should look like. It's, you know, very core and central to the show. And so it was definitely something that we knew we wanted in the game, but it also needed to be something that fit within our scope and something that was actually achievable by the team that we had. And so we sort of landed on this idea that our version of team attacks implemented in the game would be one where you are attacking an enemy, and based upon some sort of chance, that attack puts that enemy into a certain state and gives another player a button prompt. And if they actually press that button in time and under the certain correct parameters, that invokes a team attack, which is a special thing that's only accessible by that system under that situation. But even within the confines of that scope, that idea, we went through several iterations of how that could even work, and had lots of challenges associated with it. So the very first iteration of team attacks, and I believe we were discussing this, I think this actually went out and was public. If anyone participated in the combat revision beta branch that was available on Steam, it didn't. Oh, awesome! So a couple of you guys. It wasn't really. Oh, more than a couple. It wasn't really. It wasn't.
It was
actually,
the one you had to actually opt into.
Yeah, it wasn't pushed to the main branch, but it was something that if you were reading the forums and keeping up with the news updates, you could opt into and try to test out what we were doing. So this first version of team attacks, it was completely based on random chance. Every single attack you do in the game basically has a probability associated with it. And so every time you complete an attack on an enemy, a random number generator runs. If you hit within that probability, that means you could provoke a team attack. But there were some other parameters on top of it. The first one being that it chose the closest player to you as the only person who could actually finish that team attack. And then also that player had to be within a certain range of the actual enemy. So you had a lot of situations where the probability was hitting, but because the player was too far or some other issue or something else wasn't hit, you weren't actually seeing the team attack. And what we found from both playtesting ourselves and reading responses from the players on Steam was that it wasn't really achieving what we set it out to be. People weren't really getting the impression that it was intentional. They couldn't really figure out who the team attacks were coming from. They were just kind of seeing this button come up and weren't exactly sure what was going on. So we knew we had to go back to the drawing board a little bit and do some revisions and try some other things out. And so the next revision that we tried, which came out of an idea that I pitched actually in a team meeting, was, okay, well, these are supposed to be team attacks. We're supposed to be encouraging teamwork. What if both players are attacking the same enemy? That's what actually spawns a team attack. And that sounded like a really good idea, so we went ahead and implemented it, and it was a horrible failure. It was terrible, and what we found out is that, most of the time in the game, you're not attacking the same enemy. You kind of, the most efficient way to play is to divide and conquer. And so the actual situations where you could really provoke a team attack under that system came very few and far between. So again, back to the drawing board. And we ended up going through a bunch of other iterations, trying a bunch of things, and we ended up landing on what you see in the game right now. and it took a certain amount of discoveries to actually get there. One of the things was preventing the enemy from canceling his team attackable state. What it used to be was that if I put them into a team attackable state so that the button prompt is appearing above them, and another player came in and attacked them with a non-team attack, if they just used a regular melee, then that team attackable state was canceled. And that felt really, really bad as a player because I didn't want to set up a team attack and then have another player come in and cancel it just for doing what the game is already encouraging them to do, which is attack. So we ended up taking that out. Now everyone can keep beating up on the enemy, and they'll stay team attackable until a certain timer runs out. Another thing was allowing any player to execute it as opposed to just the closest player to whoever set up the team attack. And that allowed them to show up a lot more frequently, and they seem a lot more intentional that anyone can actually execute it instead of it just choosing one that just happens to be close enough to the player. We removed the range requirement, so you still have to be within a certain range of the enemy to actually execute the attack, but if you're not within the range of the enemy when it's actually set up, you can still see the button prompt, and if you move close enough, then you can execute the team attack. And that worked out really well, again, just so that more of them showed up, and they seemed like a more key element to the actual game. We prevented victims from being killed mid-team attack, which was a huge thing. If I'm Weiss and her team attack kind of has this big flourish where she jumps up into the air and brings her Mertnaster up and slams it down. And what we were finding is that because it takes a certain amount of time for her to warp over to the enemy and do the whole team attack, a lot of times that enemy was being attacked by another player already, and they would just die before they actually finished the team attack. And so I'm up in the air and then plunging my sword down into nothing, which just didn't feel good as a player. So what we ended up doing was that you can still attack the enemy, but they only get down to a certain level of damage, and the only person that can actually kill them mid-team attack is the person that's team attacking them. And that seems to have felt really well because it feels more special when you actually get to execute one. And finally, we gave the players a way to set up a team attack that wasn't completely random, so that if you wanted to go around and intentionally set up team attacks and increase your teamwork score, you can do that by performing a fully heavy charged attack on a stunned enemy. And that way, there's still the randomness so that they appear even if no one's trying to do them, but you also have a way of intentionally achieving them. So those are some of the things that led us to the system that's in the game now. Another thing I got to see some of the iteration of was the camera, which, as Casey already mentioned, is a major beast in any game, especially a third-person game, and normally has a team of people working around the clock on it. We had to figure it out in just a couple of iterations and try and get it as good as possible. So originally the camera, and I actually didn't see this. I came on after this was already changed. But originally the camera was completely controlled by the player. There was no sort of auto-adjusting. We weren't really accounting for the enemies on screen. It was just however you moved your right thumbstick, that's where the camera went. And that ended up being problematic for a few different things. Number one was that there's so many enemies in this game, and they're coming at you from all angles, that it's really easy to just sort of get picked off from off screen, and an enemy could come up and attack you and you wouldn't even see them coming just based off of where your camera was aimed. And also another key thing was that we wanted to be able to cater to players who maybe weren't as familiar with the sort of twin stick camera control philosophy. So we wanted to make sure that they had they still had the ability to play the game and could move around comfortably. So we had several issues with it and found different ways of resolving them. What we ended up doing was basically having the camera gently nudge itself and move around, trying to basically always get itself behind you so that you have that sort of very nice back view of your character and wherever you're heading. One of the problems with that arose very quickly, and that we saw a lot of comments about by our players, was that the sort of crazy camera feeling of, it's moving on its own, it's going everywhere, I can't control it, this just feels wrong. And so one of the ways we solved that was by easing back how much we were actually nudging the camera, and also by giving it a long timeout, so that if you are controlling your camera a lot, if you're moving the right stick a lot, we're not going to take control of it away from you very soon. We let you have control of it, and it's only after you haven't moved it for a while that we actually try and nudge it back for you. Another thing was the need for a sort of combat view. As I mentioned before, there's all of these enemies on screen, and we want to be able to see them all if they're forming a ring around me and all attacking me. And so the way that we solved that was the camera is aware of how many enemies are currently on screen, how many enemies are currently attacking you, and adjusts its distance away from you accordingly. So if I have 12 guys all sort of aggroed on me, forming a ring around, the camera's going to pull back and give you a nice sort of overview of the whole battlefield so that you can see what's going on. If I'm trying to take on one guy specifically and kind of go after him, then the camera pulls in and gives you a real nice view of what's going on. Another issue was giving the players the ability to reorient themselves, since we are taking control of the camera a little bit, and also give the players a lot of control over it. There were situations where players had moved their camera in such a way that they didn't even necessarily know what they were looking at, and they wanted to get back to that back view. And so we provided a centering button. So now if you pull left trigger, the camera's always going to swing right behind you. You're able to reorient yourself and keep moving forward. And finally, the big beast for any third-person game is preventing the camera from clipping into the environment. And it's something that you can get as close as possible, but it's really hard to account for all situations. But what we did is we added sort of this continual sphere cast, which is essentially us shooting a ball between the camera and the player, and seeing if anything is colliding with it. And if something does collide with the ball, then the camera sort of moves accordingly. It knows that there's something in the middle of your view, and it wants to move away from that. And that was sort of that. Adding that element prevented it both from clipping into the environment and from you getting, having an obstacle in the middle of the camera view, so that if there's a tree or something, you can still see your player. So. Lots of issues, but we found different ways of resolving them that hopefully ended up for a really nice feeling end product.
So I've only been on the team for the past month, so I came on very late in development, so they're probably thinking, what can we put Will on that won't completely break everything? But the big systems that I had a part with, I did a lot of the achievements and some of the prestige challenges that you'll get to try out in the full release on Tuesday. And what's really nice about those is that the achievements, the prestige awards, the unlockable mastery challenges that unlock skills for your character, they're all run through the exact same achievement system, and which uses object databases, as we talked about earlier. It's very interesting. But so how these achievements are unlocked is we have an object that's called a stat. And what stats do, they're basically just little dummy objects that you can increment a value on. And so what we do with these stats is we can attach them to ability definitions, like let's say an enemy was killed with an ultimate attack. We can drop a stat on that in order to track that for each character. Or if there are certain events that we need to capture in code, like we find where this thing happens in the code and drop in and increment this stat right there. And so how the achievements work is they're a separate object that you put stats onto, and it also has like what value the stat should be before this achievement should unlock. So let's say I have a prestige challenge that's like kill 300 Beowulfs or something. Well, we can make an achievement for that. That goes down the prestige tree, and we say, okay, the stat we're tracking is Beowulf's kills, and we need 300 in order to unlock this. And the way everything's set up now, it's very easy to track new different kinds of stats and set up new kinds of achievements that way. And so pretty much I can't think of anything in the game that we can't track, honestly, or that wouldn't take a huge amount of work.
Tracking
to track.
just on your client. We're not like
Yeah.
holding on to your data in
Oh,
a
no,
magic
no, no.
database anywhere.
Sending
No.
it to some NSA database.
Yeah.
NSA object database.
Gameplay related stuff, not. But yeah, that's kind of it for that system. It's very extensible, and we can add all sorts of stuff to it. So.
Triggered actions. So the triggered action system was something that me and Casey collaborated on pretty much as soon as I got hired here. And the problem
continuously.
Continuously, yeah. So it's sort of been building over time. It's a way for me as a level designer to have input into the actions of the level. Will you switch the slide, please? Wow, that's a lot of information. So it's our simple version of an input-output system, very similar to, say, like a Kismet or a Blueprint, if you guys have ever used Unreal, except way ghettoer because it's pretty bare bones, but it does what we need it to. Each triggered action is executed on the server and propagated to clients via RPC. I sounded technical there, didn't I? So it effectively drives all of the level events in the entire game. I mean, from spawning enemies, title messages, music, character messages, challenges, cutscenes, etc. There's about 50 other things that they do.
Sorry.
Yeah, so if you look on the right side, here's an example of chaining a bunch of different triggered actions, starting at the top with like continuous spawner. There's a title message action that says destroy all tanks, begins a challenge. There's some pass-through that probably starts enemy spawning, enables some switches, has some music playing, and then there's like a textured action which displays our villain on a screen somewhere. So each event in our game translated to player facing usually ends up or starts looking like this inside our editor. A big list of different action events that trigger real world actions within the level. And yeah, I guess you can continue. One of said triggered actions.
About the gear.
Oh, well, there's the gear.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first started and we were implementing this system, I thought it would be really useful to have a bunch of little editor widgets that I could play with, so that when you were flying around in a level, you'd easily be able to discern, pieces of information, what's triggering what. So I created this little gear model, and I modeled it out and textured it and everything, and Casey looked over and he's like, what the fuck are you doing? This is a massive waste of time. I'm like, trust me, man, this is going to be super useful.
Yeah, it was before I realized how fast Abe could model things.
So as you can see, there's little gears around. There's about 1 billion gears in each of our levels, and then
Yeah, you never see them in game, but they're everywhere in the editor.
Yeah. All right. Can you go to the next one? Yeah. So, actually, you know what? Go back. I didn't even talk about encounters because we were talking about gears. So one of the many triggered actions that I use is an encounter action. And the encounter system, which basically is responsible for spawning enemies, it's the core of how you interact with enemies in our game. It's evolved pretty massively over time. And I guess the first thing that I want to talk about is pre-early access. The initial system setup that we had for encounters was not nearly as data-driven as most of the other things in our game, and that presented a massive problem because it was incredibly ad hoc. Basically, every single enemy in the game was spawned individually with a spawner that I placed in the world, and it was incredibly time-consuming and arduous, and it was super messy too. It was just like hard to discern what the hell was going on in a scene because there were so many little objects scattered around. But we didn't have time to reauthor this thing before early access because we just had so much going on. And then I guess the last drawback of our previous system was that every encounter is going to be 100% exactly the same every time, and that's not super interesting, especially considering like in our early talks of vision about what our game was going to be, we kind of imagined it being a little like Left 4 Dead in that there are going to be randomized spawns and enemies that would come in sometimes and sometimes they wouldn't. Not to the same extent of writing our own AI director, but we definitely wanted to have a degree of randomness to encounters. And we didn't have that pre-early access, although it was something that we implemented afterwards. You want to? Yeah. So this is what the setting up an encounter used to look like, and if you can imagine, this is what every single encounter scene in every level looked like, and it was just crazy. Super inconvenient. And as you can see, each one of the spawners has like a little sign above it that says what the spawner is. It's a Beowulf, or it's a Ursa, or a Creep, or whatever. Continue. Okay, so the encounter refactor is something we got to after we shipped for early access, and basically had a couple weeks to evaluate different aspects of the triggered action system and encounter system and stuff like that. And we came up with sort of a novel way of creating encounters very quickly for further content. And we ended up reverse integrating this into all of our existing levels as well. So the big key points is that we wanted encounters to be much more data-driven, and this plays right into Casey's object database thing. So now, instead of hand constructing encounters, we still hand construct encounters, but we do it in sort of an abstract way outside of levels, where we come up with like say 50 different types of encounters. We outline them out in an encounter object. As you can see on the right here, we have a Beowulf Alpha 01, which is just the name of an encounter that I pre-created. And basically, each one of these groups has like an enemy definition, whether or not the previous group has been spawned, defeated, the delay in seconds, total enemies for that group, delay between spawns, delay variation, and then it gives you this awesome little readout that Casey put in that gives you the total XP you'll get from killing all those enemies, as well as a little descriptor, sentence descriptor of what's happening. Which is pretty freaking slick compared to our last iteration. So
I had to make it extra good to make up for how bad the last one
was. Yeah. So on the right here is basically an example of one encounter in our game, probably used like many times in many different areas, but probably randomized as one of many possible encounters. And I guess one thing I didn't talk about also is the spawn pools. Was a way of us basically reusing spawn locations so that we don't have that mess of spawners throughout the entire level. Now you could basically, have 5 to 10 spawners in one area, and the encounter will decide where to spawn the enemies based on which spawners have just been used and whatnot. And the difference in aesthetic of the spawning is very, very marginal. It really can't tell. So next one, please. So here's an example of the same encounter post early access after we've basically set it up to use the new system. Way cleaner. It says tasty, yeah, because it's tasty. The dynamic encounter on the right is basically an example of how I set up one encounter in the level. And as you can see, I have 3 random choices. One that contains each one basically tells you exactly what it's spawning. And so when you come into this encounter and you play this wave encounter, you get to this one and it spawns one of these 3 groups. So to add a bit of variety to the game, when you play, just so when you play through Emerald Forest 1 again, it's not going to be 100% the same every time, which we feel added some cool variety to our game. All right. Okay. Well, I'm just going to continue talking because I did this one too. Art pipeline. Okay. So when I got hired on board, and actually for the majority of the process, I was the only world builder on our team until we hired Andy Cortez, who was fantastic, and he actually made it so that I could stop being so sloppy in my art creation because I could spend a little more time on stuff. But at the start of the process, I had to come up with a very novel way of sort of cutting corners to produce lots and lots of art assets that would have no detriment to the like effect of the visual fidelity. And so I came up with sort of process that I'd used I'd sort of prototyped before. And essentially it's, you know, when you, well, let's see. Well, there's a summary, but it goes into further detail. So can you just go to the next slide? Okay, so usually in like modern day art, the way that you usually start with props is either like sculpting a high poly model to get a lot of detail out of your prop, or making a high poly sub-D model or whatever. The reason that you do that is because you want to use that as the basis for baking normal information into a low poly asset. Can you go to the next frame? So because we have budget restrictions and all sorts of technical limitations in the way of memory and polygon counts and stuff like that, I mean, like if you really look at the frame try count or polygon count of every one of our scenes, it's going to be somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million. In some cases, maybe a bit more, which sounds like a lot, but it would be a hell of a lot more if we actually implemented these high poly models. But the way that you get the same amount of detail out of a prop without just using a high poly model is you bake normal information from a high poly model to a low poly model. And what that effectively does is takes the detailed information from the high poly and it encodes it onto the surface area of the low poly model, gives it the illusion of looking like it has a lot more detail than it actually does, and that's expressed in a normal map, if any of you guys know what a normal map is. And the way that I basically got around retopologizing low poly models is that I would, in a lot of cases, construct these high poly models, run it through a mesh reducer, which would basically systemically create a low poly model based on a polygon budget that I specified. So before it was something like 400,000 polygons, and I reduced it down to 502. Can you go to the next slide? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Substance Painter, which is a really sweet painting tool. I don't know if any of you guys are artists, but it's a pretty standard sort of modern texture pipeline. Really incredible. And so what I was just talking about, baking normals, this asset, left and right, is actually the same asset, but the one on the right has had the information from the high poly baked into the low poly asset, which gives it a lot of detail information in terms of how it's going to diffuse light in different directions and stuff like that. It's really, really cool effect. But it still looks like Chrome, so that's not gonna go very far in game. So let's go to the next frame. So I utilized smart materials a lot, which is something that you can create in Substance Painter. Basically, what a smart material is a folder filled with material layers as well as generators, which can apply. Can you go to the next one? Data for dirt, edge wear, material layering, all sorts of stuff. So this asset right now is using a smart material that I created that has a base concrete. It has edge wear, which basically cuts out, based on a curvature map, the areas where there are angled surfaces, and it highlights them to make it look like there's some edge wear. It'll use its ambient occlusion map, which is basically where light is caught in between cracks, to apply a dirt map, which I'm using. So you can see in the corners there's dirt applied, and I think I have like a dirt map that's projecting down from the top. So can you go to the next frame? This is another asset that I used. I just wholesale took the smart material, applied it right on, and it basically just textured the asset for me. And it's pretty awesome. I mean, I wouldn't stop there. Like, I'd usually go in and paint some additional detail in, or like for Emerald Forest, there's a lot of sort of runic, like ruined, like text and stuff on the assets. But at least this gets me 80% of the way there, which is a massive time saver as far as asset creation goes. So I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, I was told to warn you guys when the lights are about to come up because it's gonna be an experience. So go ahead and bring them up.
Yeah, so that's all the information we have. We'll take some questions now, and if we run out of time, feel free to come up afterwards, and we'll take more questions after the talk.
I think we have about 17 minutes,
Yeah.
so we should be good.
Anyone with questions, if you'll please line up right in the middle aisle, and I'll hand off the mic to the front person, and he'll hand it off to everyone behind him. Also, please do not touch any of the tech equipment up front.
So no spoiler questions, right?
What's that?
What's that?
No spoiler questions, right?
Preferably. I don't know that there's much left for us to spoil, but
So you mentioned there being you mentioned you did certain things because the scope of the game was going to be PvE based. I was wondering if you ever had any intentions of extending it to PvP. Just like I'd like to know if there's any discussion about like how that would be implemented in a different way than you do PvE right now, because obviously you'd be against other people.
Sure. I think first off, we would want to look at having dedicated servers before
Right.
we try to do anything PvP based.
Because you would want it to be server authoritative in most cases.
Hmm. Yeah, the clients would not be able to be making these like authority calls to say, I hit you. So like in a
900 damage.
exactly. If you could say, I think I hit you, and then the server would say, okay, let's look at where everybody was and see if you actually hit the person.
The idea I just thought of while you were putting it up there was like a counterattack like exchange system that'd probably be hell for latency, but yeah, I just had a thought. So
Can you elaborate a little bit? I'm not sure I understand.
Well, what I was thinking of is like, so the player would swing, or say like Ruby's trying to hit Blake or something. Ruby would swing, and Blake from her end would see like a much shorter windup that she could counter, and you would basically just have that back and forth until somebody messes up their timing, and that would result in one person getting hit, and you could make it more elaborate than that.
Yeah, I think that you kind of touched on what we'd have to do a little bit. Is like the wind up would look shorter for one person than it would for another. Like to do things like that, probably you'd want to incorporate the animations
Yeah.
to offset the latency to try to disguise what was actually going on.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
So I was just wondering, for each one of you personally, what's your preferred way of like learning how to do something? Like, I know there's always like going to school and taking classes and always looking it up online, but I guess just at the moment I'm having trouble figuring out myself personally how I learn best. So individually, how do you prefer?
Jeff, you want to start?
yeah, I mean, I have taken maybe 2 programming classes in my entire life, and so my preferred way of learning is really learning by doing. Thanks to the age that we live in, there's the answer to almost any question is available somewhere online, and so it's really a lot of trial and error, and whenever you have questions, seeking out the answer, looking up things, reading things wherever you can, and just sort of trying to amass as much information as possible, I guess. And I've always found that I learn exponentially more when I'm working on something and trying to actually achieve it, and can look back and see, okay, this is where I went wrong, this is what I could have done better, this I could have done more efficiently, and then I move on and do it better the next time. So I really try to learn by doing.
Me too. Yeah. So one really good way of doing that is doing game jams. Game jams are like a compact way of learning how to make a whole game. and you won't learn as much from a single game jam as like a year-long dev cycle, but it's in the same ballpark, honestly, because you're going through the whole thing from start to finish. And if you're just like picking up little prototypes and then abandoning them, you're not really getting the whole picture of what developing a game is.
So what really worked for me is I went to school to learn everything I know programming-wise, and of course you need to do a lot of like personal projects and like just learning by doing, of course, but I also think it can also be supplemented by finding a mentor and like a professor,
Absolutely.
or trying to get in contact with someone who knows this kind of stuff that you can learn from. And that's really helpful for me to just like find that one person to kind of maybe model your style after, or to learn more stuff from, on top of all the things you're doing yourself. So.
Yeah, I'm like these guys in that I mostly learn through doing, but kind of to an extreme degree, sort of like a trial by fire thing where I try to find the most difficult problem possible to solve, and I will get lots of supplemental knowledge throughout the process. Even if it takes me a month to learn something or to solve the problem, I will have learned lots of different things within that. I mean, when I started learning guitar, like I was like, I don't want to learn this easy shit. I want to go and learn like to shred or something. And so I learned this song that was really, really hard to play. But by the time that I learned it, I'd learned to like alternate pick and do all of these different like arpeggios and all this stuff. So that's a sort of unrelated example, but it translates in a way to game development, in that like, that at least for me, that's what how I tend to operate. I think also like when I find people that are certifiably way better than I am, I love that because it's a lot easier to learn from those sort of people, I think.
I guess kind of follow up, tiny little thing. Do you guys like anyone do like online videos of like what they're doing, or I guess even more in depth like tech videos like what you're doing here?
You know, we've talked about doing stuff like that. And I hope we will do that at some point. We were gonna like do a stream of us just writing code. Don't know if anybody would have watched it, but we may still do that at some point in the
definitely
future.
watch it.
Yeah.
Don't edit out all of the language.
Hey, so mainly concerning a single player and games partied up with friends, I wanted to know what's your opinion on mods made by the community, and is that something you would support or be against?
I'm actually fine with them doing it. And if there are any modders here, I'd love to talk to you after the talk, because I'm not even completely sure how people are making mods. So maybe if I had a little bit more information about that, we could actually do a thing or two to make it easier. What we don't want to see is people making mods to give other people bad experiences in the game. So as long as you're not making mods that are just allowing you to cheat.
Also, if the mod allows you to play the game without buying it, that's probably not good.
Yeah, that's not
Preferably
great.
not.
Yep, so we're open to it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so for those budding game design makers, whatever you want to call them, each one of you, what 3 programs could you not survive without? If you had to choose 3 to do your jobs, what would they be?
I'm going to answer first because I'm going to take all of Casey's answers. I mean,
Visual Studio's not an
the 3 core programs that I use are Perforce, Unity, and Visual Studio. Those are my 3 apps.
Perforce, and Perforce is my. Perforce is a version control system. It's amazing.
If you're an aspiring game developer, and I don't think we actually said this in either of the past 2 panels, but learn source control.
Yeah.
Let it be the first thing you learn, because it saves your butt.
It's like as important as Unity.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Unity, Visual Studio, and Perforce.
I'm not even going to say Perforce because these guys have beat a dead horse, but Substance Painter, Photoshop, and Modo.
Okay, even for for 3D modeling and things like that?
Modo.
Moto.
I mean ZBrush, but I didn't have 4, so.
We also use this really cool tool called Swarm for doing code reviews. So it integrates with Perforce, and you make a shelved change list, and then other people can look at your changes and comment on them.
Yeah.
And it's just really great for getting all engineers more visibility into all the code that's going in.
Not a single line of code is submitted to our project without being looked at by someone else that didn't write it.
Except when I sneak in the code. No, never.
What?
Y'all mentioned y'all's 2000 object database. Is that in C# or JavaScript? In Unity?
Unity stores that information in a proprietary format. I'm not exactly sure what it's called.
Most of the script in the game, though, is C#. There's a little bit of JavaScript hanging on, but...
Yeah,
So you're talking about how scriptable objects are?
Yeah, there's like 2,000 scriptable objects that define lots of different data, and it kind of forms like a web of data that the game uses. There's about 30,000 lines of C# code that we wrote, which really isn't that much.
There's a lot of Java boot camps out there. Would that be a waste of time for people?
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Java, but
Yeah, I don't think learning is ever a bad idea.
yeah. I mean, most programming languages are so similar to one another that if you learn one, you've learned most of them.
If you know if you learn like the logic and all that stuff, you can pretty much pick up any language. Honestly, it's just an issue of like just learning all the keywords and stuff like that. It's learning the quirks of each language.
So with the full release coming out, is there, like, can we expect to possibly see further additions to the game, like skins or something cosmetic, or maybe levels that focus on other characters, maybe some villains?
One thing I can tell you we're definitely planning is Horde mode. We wanted to have it in this version, but we just didn't get it done in time. So Horde mode. I'm sorry if people heard something else.
That's a different game.
Yeah.
Our plan is to keep working on this for quite some time.
As an aspiring game designer, so you said you're 3, but what are probably going to help me the most?
As a game designer?
You mean like what applications or?
Yeah, as a starter.
I mean, we've said it I think before a little bit, but just download one of the engines and start playing around with it. Start making things.
Yeah, so Unity is a great place to start if you're looking to get into game design or level design. Unity is pretty intuitive. There really isn't that much to learn to get going and to make a playable level and stuff like that. So,
I've actually already used Unity on Personal Edition.
Sure.
Is there a major difference between the Personal Edition and the company?
Not anymore.
No.
No, it has all the same features except for some extensions like cloud build and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's almost completely identical now.
Yeah.
The multiplayer interface you use, my school has been trying to figure that out for a while, so we can make a little LAN thing. Is it possible for a 20-student team of just starters to be able to incorporate that?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
You got twice as many people as we did.
Oh. How many, what was that program called again?
Photon.
Photon?
Yeah, come talk to me after the panel. I'll tell you a little more about it.
Okay, hi. I'm like an aspiring game programmer, but I'm having a bit of it. My question was basically answered like the first one. So, but I was wondering, like, I'm having an issue like trying to like figure out, like, I've touched on Java, and I touched on like C++ and into C, and it's like I can't quite figure out like what would you recommend would be like the best like starter language for like a newbie?
Blueprint actually might be something to look at.
Wait, what?
Blueprint. So Blueprint is a visual programming language that's integrated into the Unreal Engine, and it's
a successor to Kismet. I
Yeah,
believe?
successor to Kismet, which they use in Unreal 3. It's really, really easy to pick up, and some of the stuff that you learn with Blueprint, when you want to learn like a non-visual programming language, it'll carry over, and you'll kind of help lay the foundation of how a language works and what it does.
I also learned on a language called processing, which is a descendant of Java, and it's a nice language because it's not there's not a bunch of bells and whistles that kind of to get lost in. It really sort of forces you to learn the basics, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily similar to the major game programming languages, but another option.
3-minute warning, just FYI.
Okay.
Thank you.
2 minutes on my watch.
Okay. Don't know if anyone else cares about this, but this is just more a me question. At the RWBY panel, they said in Volume 4 they were gonna add new Grimm and redesign some of the old ones. I was wondering if you would see any designs for enemies similar to what they make in future updates.
Maybe. Sorry, we can't really say for sure.
I just had a question. It's kind of like a tech and game design decision question. Like just one, and I'm sure you solved it already, but like one question that pointed out to me while you were doing the demo is how you mentioned how the enemies sort of form a ring around you. So when it comes to like balancing, for instance, like obviously like, all right, Ruby has a big size, so she just swings in a circle and deals with that circle. So how do you balance, this is how the game engine works, but like for maybe like a more single target person like Yang, for instance? I know she has a lot larger shotgun than she does in the show, but like how do you balance that between the tech and then like what the characters themselves do?
Iteration, I guess, would be my answer. Trial and error.
I guess to be more specific, though, Ruby's main attack doesn't really do it in a circle unless you're doing her special. But it is true that she can attack multiple targets at once, and say Weiss, for instance, can't, or Blake. So usually what that translates to is that Ruby's splash damage is going to be way less than direct hits from Weiss or from Yang, right? So.
We just play it. We play the game a lot, and we change the damage numbers a lot until it kind of feels good.
I think we have time for maybe one more if it's really quick.
Okay. Yeah, but you can ask us questions afterwards outside.
Yeah, just stick around.
Hi. So, in reference to you guys continually updating the game, has it been decided whether that's going to be free or is it going to be like DLC stuff, or?
I believe Horde is going to be an update. Yeah, free update. But the character stuff would be different.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Our
you
time's
guys.
up.